This is Coffee with Kelly, a dynamic podcast that's dedicated to driving positive change in school safety. I'm your host, Ethan Woodman, Product Marketing Specialist for Crisis Go, and I'm joined by my esteemed colleague, Kelly Moore, Senior School Safety Specialist for Crisis Go. Our mission is to empower you with essential knowledge, tools, and inspiration required to foster a safer and more secure school environment. We hope this podcast will be the catalyst for transformation in your schools. Join us as we continue to dive into the world of school safety. Good morning, Kelly.
Good morning, Ethan. How are you?
I'm doing pretty good.
Yeah. So what do we got going today? What's happening today?
We'll start off with a little news. So the first one I'll start off with was recently in Memphis, Tennessee. I think this was maybe just yesterday or so. Basically, police were getting calls of a man that was shooting a rifle randomly in the air around 11 a.m. And the concerning part about this was he was about a minute from the school, just walking. So he was pretty close.
And he's just randomly shooting in the air.
He's just randomly shooting this rifle in the air. And they say that he had about 100 rounds of ammunition on him. So
fair amount, right?
Good amount. And so obviously the cops, knowing that he was so close to the school, they very quickly notified the school what was going on. And then that school went on a lockdown.
First of all, that's good to hear that there is that communications, right? And that there's that process involved. Oftentimes, and I'm sure it's getting better than when I was in law enforcement, and it's evolving and getting much better between those communications and so forth. But oftentimes law enforcement gets so focused on what's happening and the danger of that situation, they neglect or forget to notify the schools and so forth. It takes too much energy while other people, because they're still receiving 911 calls, they're getting updates from the caller where it's going, they're getting all this radio traffic from all the responding patrol cars. So oftentimes that gets neglected. Having that ability to do that quickly is huge, right? And so if you have the ability to notify law enforcement quickly, it only makes sense that they have the ability to notify you quickly, right?
Yes.
So that you can take protective actions. Oftentimes, like Alyssa's laws, actually, they don't require that.
They don't require the other way around.
They don't require the reciprocation of that, right? So having that ability, because here's the reality. The reality is that there are, just by the nature, you are more likely to be impacted by an external law enforcement action than you are from an internal action. That makes sense, right? So you have, obviously, as a school, you have this precious little package that contains all these little kids and teachers and parents and employees and so forth that need to be protected. So, when we start talking about I love you guys and their lockdown, secure, hold, evacuate, and shelter standard response protocols, when you start talking about that, you're more likely going to need one or all of those from an external, something going on outside of the school that could flow into your school or impact your school. Having that ability to notify is critical. They can, in today's society, of course, with Crisis Go, they can do that. They can have that button that pushes that school. They can pull up that school group and notify them to go into a lockdown. We call it an announcement. It's critical to have that. I don't know that Memphis does. I don't know, but at least they had the wherewithal to make that notification, because a minute walking time from a school is in the next block, essentially. right?
Yeah.
So that's close. We can count this kind of as a near miss, although it wasn't directly targeting the school that we know of at this point. But it is one of those things that could have easily been tragic if he took a left
Yeah. I
instead
mean,
of a
like,
right.
how many blocks are there in a mile? How many feet is a block?
It's different for different areas. You know, in New
Because
York
I mean,
City,
like
New York
a
City.
rifle round can easily go what, like about a mile.
Sure.
I don't know what direction this guy was popping off rounds, but
Well, and here's the other thing, right? He's randomly shooting into the air. So those rounds have to come down somewhere.
yeah, yep,
So bringing everyone inside, if nothing else, bringing everyone inside just to make sure that one of those rounds doesn't hit an unintended target. Good on everybody, I think. We
yeah,
don't hear about these near misses enough because there are a lot of them. And we have a tendency to review, scrutinize those completed acts. We spend a lot of time, effort, money to evaluate these completed acts. What went wrong? But we have a tendency not to do the same on these things that went well, that ended well, right?
mm.
So, and were there things that went wrong? Were there things that we could have done better? Communications better, quicker? Are there technologies that are available that can make that process much better? Right. So it's just one of those things that, you know, we should be looking at them, and we don't talk about the successes enough. And I don't know why we don't, but we obviously don't. But generally speaking, one of the reasons is maybe this is the reason, is if it went correctly, then we believe, okay, that went right. But you know, this is
Yeah.
we did a podcast and a blog about this not too long ago. Did you do it right or did you get lucky? And I've told you that story a few times, so I'm not going to repeat it here. But we have to make sure that we're doing it
Thanks.
correctly. You're welcome. We have to make sure that we're doing it correctly. And the reason that we were successful is because we did it correctly, not just because we got lucky. In the way of Forrest Gump. That's all I have to say about that.
I'll actually go over another thing in the news. So this is a thing that went wrong. So I think maybe the answer to your question is, you know, it's hard to find a news article about something that went right. You know, obviously the negative stuff sells
Oh,
better on the
absolutely.
news. So that's whenever you get something on the news that's got a school whatever involved, it's usually always negative in some degree. So
Yeah. But there's also the politics involved too, right?
yes, that's very true. Also, just a couple days ago, a high school student who was 19, so he's hospitalized as of this moment. He was shot at the bus stop.
Mm-hmm.
So this was around 7 a.m. and this was in
St. Louis, wasn't it?
St. Louis. Did I already say that?
I
I'm
don't
losing
know.
my mind. Basically, he was waiting for the bus to show up, and two people came up behind him and said, "Give me your phone," and he refused, and so they shot him for it. So here's the interesting thing in this article that I'm reading.
Before you get going, was it a school bus stop or a city bus stop? Do we know that?
So it says a high school student remains hospitalized after being shot during a robbery near his bus stop.
But it doesn't indicate whether his bus stop is a school run bus service or a.
It says the 19-year-old victim was waiting for the bus. I mean, it kind of makes you think that it's a school bus stop, but I
Okay.
guess maybe
We'll make that assumption that it is for the sake of
yeah.
this, but it could be either, right?
Yeah. So then it says video taken by someone in the area shows the moments immediately after the shooting. The victim can be seen on the ground after he had been shot as police and others arrive at the scene. Police said the victim is expected to survive. Oh, here we go. So the school bus driver is the person who called 911.
Okay, so
it was a
school bus. Okay, good.
But it almost makes you think that the person taking video was taking video before the bus driver got there, but maybe they started taking video after. I don't know. But
It wasn't the person taking video that called 911 though, right?
That's correct. It was a school bus driver that called 911.
Yeah. So there's a couple of things we can unpack here. First of all, it's this spectator mentality, right? They don't want to get involved in today's society with TikTok and Instagram and Snapchat and all these other social media. They want to get that and go post something that can go viral, right? They want that sort of recognition. They're doing that before calling 911. And the reality is you can do both at the same time if you feel that need. But if you're going to do one or the other, call 911 first. It would have been tragic if you're just watching somebody bleed out. You're not giving any aid. You're not doing anything to help them survive a wound that, in this case, what seems to be survivable. And while you're just taking video, I don't get it.
And like, so then they include a quote that says, I heard like 5 or 6 gunshots really loud, said one resident who asked not to be identified. It's not really unusual to hear some in the neighborhood, meaning that it's not unusual to hear gunshots in the neighborhood. But then I heard those, got really scared, and I looked out the window and saw the victim on the ground, but didn't call police.
Yeah, but there's this reluctance to get involved with things like that, especially when there's this potential for retaliation. And, I don't know the circumstances in which they live. And some people live in areas that they fear retaliation all the time. So I get it, but it doesn't, you can remain anonymous and call 911 and say, hey, there's some dude that was just shot. I could see him out my window. Looks like a robbery. And oh, here comes a bus now. So there's other kids involved, or, just give them some information, because if those people are still in the area and the bus shows up, now every other kids that's on that bus is in that field of view there, right? In January, we did this series on bus safety and what buses mean to your school safety plan. And part of that was just explaining that buses and bus drivers are an extension of your school. Your bus stop is an extension of that school. If it's a bus stop, generally there's, especially in an area like St. Louis, depending on the neighborhood, there's probably 5 or 10 kids that are waiting there to get on that bus. So that's no different than your parents dropping your kids off and they walk out and they're all 10 of them are meeting in the playground before school starts, right? It's the exact same thing. So they're starting their school day as soon as they get to the bus stop. They're entering the school space as soon as they get onto the bus. And the bus driver, doing the right thing, sees something's going on and he's calling 911 to get this kid help, which is the right thing. But it shows you how integral those employees are, the bus drivers are, because that is the first school employee on scene helping that kid. We need to make sure that if that's a potential, which obviously it is, we need to make sure that our bus drivers understand exactly what to do. And good on him or her, I don't know which, good on them for doing the right thing.
Yep, for
if
sure.
You see something like that, get help. Dial 911, do whatever, right?
Don't take video.
Don't take video. But, that goes to the other part of this, right, is you have an emergency on your bus, and how do they get help? Are you relying on them to call 911? Can they have a panic button? Technology says yes. Do they have radios that they can communicate with the school to say, hey, this is what's going on? Because there's a couple things that are going to happen, right? He's helping the victim there, which he should be. He or she should be. But all of those other kids need to get to school. There's other kids probably down the line that need to be picked up and transferred to school. He can't just focus on the task at hand, which is helping the kid. How does he help the school get everything else that is required of him, get that done while he's there focusing, right? Do you have radios that you can press a panic button on? If you don't, and you want some, call us at Crisis Go. We have that. There's the ability to work many things at one time if you understand all that needs to be done. If you're not thinking about your bus drivers and where they fit into your safety program, you need to start thinking about that. Here's a perfect example of that. What if that had happened on the bus? What would happen then? What's our main topic today? This is going to be a good one, I think. Maybe not. I don't want to hype it up too much.
Today, we're going to be talking about non-lethal options.
Less than lethal.
Yes.
You know why I say that? Because less than lethal weapons that are used inappropriately can cause a fatality. So they're not non-lethal. They're less than lethal. Their intent is not to be lethal, right? But if you misuse them or you use them in a manner that wasn't prescribed for that less than lethal option, then it could cause injuries that could result in death. The other side of that is there are ways that you can make a less than lethal weapon lethal, depending on the conditions and the situation you're in. The whole class of these options are considered less than lethal because they weren't intended or developed to be lethal options. We have enough of those.
I wish I could find the one that I sent you a while back. I got to screen share some of these because I think, for those that want to be on YouTube and actually see our faces, you get to actually see better content. So I'm going to share this one. I think this is where we started. So this is actually a company in
South Africa.
South Africa. You can actually get these in the US. You can import them. I mean, I don't know what the tariffs are going to look like now, but anyways, so basically this thing is remote controlled and it shoots paintball size nylon balls.
What we're really talking about is the force continuum. The use of force continuum is something that law enforcement and I believe the military has been using for decades. I don't ever remember, I started in law enforcement in 1984 and long before Ethan was born. And we were talking about and using the use of force continuum. And basically what it is the use of force continuum is guided by this simple principle. Legally, you can only use that force which is necessary to stop the aggression on you or somebody else, to protect yourself or somebody else. Generally speaking, somebody's punching you. You can't use lethal force on them. But there are ways that if they're punching you, you could be justified, right? So it's not saying if this happens and you have to do this. It's this continuum and based upon the circumstances and the situation that you're in. But generally speaking, it's guided by that premise that you as a law enforcement officer, you as somebody who's trying to stop aggression or violence or some forceful act, you can meet that force with as much force as necessary to stop and control those actions. In law enforcement, that first step on that use of force continuum is command presence and voice commands. And then you start going up and you start introducing maybe control holds, maybe the baton, maybe chemical sprays, maybe depending on situations, it might be a beanbag round that is shot out of a shotgun so that you can create some distance between you and whatever is happening. In some cases, you can use lethal force in a non-lethal manner. Shooting somebody in the leg is generally non-lethal.
Sure.
Just an example. I'm not saying you should do it. I'm just saying that's an example. And you can use things that aren't even considered necessarily weapons in a lethal manner. So like a car, right? That's generally not thought of as a weapon, but used appropriately, that can be a less lethal or a lethal option. Now, the courts can get involved in this in the definition and so forth. They can say that because it is capable of being lethal, it has to be considered lethal force. That's circumstantial and situational. The problem that we get into is when we start looking at it, we have to justify all of those acts of or uses of force. If the amount of force is justifiable, then it really doesn't matter how or what you use to get there. So you can use a gun as a weapon that is not shot, right? I can take you and hit you with the butt end of a gun. I can poke your eye with the barrel without shooting it, right? So universally considered a lethal weapon.
Yes.
But I can use it in a manner that is not intended to be lethal, right? I just have to be able to articulate that as the one using the force.
Probably a big question that our listeners would have is why?
Why are we talking about this?
If I have someone coming into my school with what I think is a real weapon and what I think is their intention is to deal lethal harm, why should I care about implementing a solution that is less than lethal? Why should I bother?
Because that question goes to the heart of the problem and why we need less than lethal options. Let me ask you this in response to your question. What is the probability that somebody is going to walk into your school today with a weapon?
Probably pretty slim.
Pretty slim. But there's incidences every day that we have to deal with that include uses of force, right?
Like a bullying event in the hallway or
a fight,
something like that.
Some kid who's standing off against an administrator or a teacher or something, threatening something. They don't have a weapon necessarily. Maybe they have a stapler in their hand or something, or they're threatening to harm themselves or threatening to harm somebody else, but they don't have a firearm, right? We're much more likely to engage in that kind of incident than we are with somebody walking into your school or somebody who's already in your school having possession of a firearm. And the reason I bring this to the table is over the last 3 weeks or so, maybe 4 weeks now, I've been contacted by companies wanting to partner with us at Crisis Go. Generally speaking, we tend to partner with other technology companies that we can integrate with through the use of our technology, and they're combining them to make us both better, right? We generally don't partner with weapons, companies that have weapons or what have you, right? But it really brought to the front of my mind, it brought up we don't really talk about less lethal. We don't really talk about these other options. And we're much more likely to have a need for that than we are a need for arming our teachers, throwing more SROs into the mix, throwing the Guardian program in there. If we are just thinking about safety from, okay, we're safe or we're being shot at scenario, there's nothing in between, then we're not thinking of this correctly, right? We have to have these options. People have to have these options. And there are generally 4 or 5 different categories that I would throw less lethal options into. All less lethal does is it fills that gap between yelling at the kid and sending them to the principal's office and an active shooter or active violence or active threat situation. There's a huge gap there. So what we're talking about is mace, distraction devices, light, sound, things that disorient somebody, that causes their eyes to be irritated or have difficulty breathing. Not that they can't breathe, but inhaling OC pepper spray or mace or something can make it so that you shift your focus from what you wanted to do to what you think you have to do, and that's breathe, right?
Just hopefully the kid doesn't have asthma or something.
Well, generally those things aren't really affected that much. They can probably, I guess, but not enough that, or we don't see it enough that says, oh, you can't use this anymore.
What about a taser?
Tasers.
I guess with those, you still have to, there's still the argument of what if a student were to grab the taser from a teacher or whoever and use it against them?
It's less lethal, right?
Yeah, at least there's less risk that way, but
it generally is not going to, if I tase you, as soon as the electric current stops, you're good to go.
It's funny because it's like, way back in the day, I think teachers would just have a paddle. So kid acted out, you get smacked. And it was funny because I've been working on, we're possibly coming up with a new booth design for our events. So I've been
Mhm.
researching, the history of school safety, and so I'm like, who better to ask than my parents?
Yeah, the old people.
Yeah, the old people. And so they grew up in Maine, like way up in Maine. And I think generally from what I've been seeing, I think a lot of schools in Maine are a little bit behind the curve technology wise. So
Mhm.
I guess this doesn't surprise me, but back in, my dad said he graduated high school in 1973. So he said even, so all his years before then, he's like, we didn't have any school safety stuff. And I'm like, so like if a kid acted out, like, did the teacher walk them to the principal? Do they just walk themselves? He's like, no, the teacher just dealt with it in the classroom in
Classroom.
front
Yeah,
of
yeah.
all the
Yeah,
kids.
yeah. So I mean, I'm not quite as old as your parents, but I'm close.
Yeah.
I was 10 when he graduated high school. I remember when kids got out of line, we had this one teacher. I always got along with him well, but he did not take crap from anybody. He literally would pick them up by the collar and shove them up against the wall and say, "Do you want to go there?" And everyone was like, "Holy crap!" Right? But we can't do that.
You can't do
And
that
I'm not.
anymore.
We've talked about that.
But those kids probably didn't act up in that class
No,
anymore after
but I
that.
will tell you that they didn't act up. They didn't, there were boundaries. And if he got fed up with you, he let you know. And so did everyone else. It wasn't just the male teachers, the female teachers did as well. And even if you did not get sent to the principal, you knew the principal knew about it,
Mm.
right? So that could be taken care of. And if you got in trouble, which I did a lot, if you got in trouble, you knew two people knew about it: the principal and your parents.
See, this is the downside of being homeschooled, is that when you acted up,
Because it's
you,
both, right?
your teacher was also your parents, so they had a
Correct.
little bit more
Leverage.
leverage.
Yeah.
They could punish you a little bit more
Right. But
from
this,
a legal
this
standpoint.
and I'm not saying we should use these options to control the classroom. There's other ways of controlling your classroom, but there
Yes.
are times when it gets out of hand, and there are times when your only option in today's society, the way we think, is either nothing or lethal. There are lots of
Mm.
things that are occurring every day in the school that fall somewhere in between that, right? But our teachers don't have that. Our security staff doesn't have that. Our SROs probably do.
They probably have a baton or something like that.
They have a baton, they have pepper spray, they would have a taser or something similar. It's crazy that we're not even talking about that.
Do you think that we're not doing that from a legal? I feel like that's probably why we're not doing it, right? Because if some teacher were to, even if they're totally in the right, like defending themselves, you've got some, 100 some pound, 180 pound high school kid coming at you, like, what are you gonna do? You go and tase them or something, and then their
Yeah,
parent comes at you and says, how could you
yeah.
do this? My son's an angel.
Here's the deal, which is probably what we're going to change the podcast to. Kelly says, here's the deal. But here's the deal. As soon as you start talking about lethal force, you cannot not talk about other options. Morally speaking, you can't give somebody a single choice
Yeah.
in this kind of setting. You just can't. And we talk about active shooter and weapons on campus. A school, I think they're about 45 minutes away from me yesterday. Was it yesterday? I think it was Monday. A student reported that there was a gun on campus. It gets reported. Cops come in, and three, these are middle schoolers,
Wow.
are in the process of having a transaction where they are trying to sell the gun. There's no intent to shoot anything that they found. They just thought it was a good idea that would be the place that you should make this transaction. Oh, let's take care of this at school, right? So
middle schoolers doing gun deals.
Right. It's fantastic, isn't it?
What?
Exactly. But we talk about like the only problem we're ever going to have in a school is an active shooter, an active violence, an active threat, whatever vernacular you want to use. It's crazy because you're much more likely to have a severe weather event. You're much more likely to have some lesser thing. You're much more likely to have an external situation that impacts your school, like the one that we talked about earlier. You're much more likely to have something outside impact internally or something of a lesser than an active shooter. But we're not giving you the options. We're not even talking about them. So unless we start talking about less than lethal as an option, and you and I have been talking about the potential of less lethal for
a while,
6 months, 8 months now, at least.
Yeah.
But if we don't start talking about that, obviously, if we don't talk about it, we'll never talk about it. So this right here is really meant to get that conversation started. What does it look like? Why aren't we doing it? Because it goes into, it's not my responsibility, but it is. If you're not going to go and solve any violent problem, if you're not going to touch anything that is disruptive or violent or potentially potentially impactful or potentially harmful, if you're not going to address any of those, what are you doing there?
Right.
If your only option is to call somebody else, first of all, the time frame that it takes there, even if it's only a couple of minutes, things escalate beyond the control. And if you're not addressing it at its first indication that you have an issue, then you're allowing it to escalate to where it may lead into a problem that you can only solve with lethal force, right? So this goes into left of bang and responding before the bang. Right now, we have a lot of our competitors are still in response. Our schools are still in response. Law enforcement has always been a response agency. Call 911, they will come, right? They have always been a response agency, other than, the patrol trying to prevent something and see it. But they're still looking for it to happen. They're not investigating everybody. They don't have the insight to say, oh, that guy is about to do this, whatever that is. But they can start looking and start seeing what's going on, but everything is in response to. So if we start bringing in, again, we start shifting to left of bang and having our response before bang and looking at the ability to start something. Let's go back to the guy that's walking around shooting into the air, right? Let's change the circumstances just a little bit. He's doing whatever it is that he's doing. He's shooting into the air. If he had a plan to target the school and he's going through those actions, what kind of actions would you classify those as other than dangerous? What's my go-to on active threats? Leakage.
That's always the one I forget. I always forget that.
I've got so much going in my mind, I can't contain it anymore. Something is going to spill out. I'm going to either talk about it, I'm going to do something that indicates that I'm about ready to attack a school. If this guy you said it was Memphis?
Yes.
That wasn't a very assertive yes.
I had to think about it because we talked about two different ones. I want to make sure I was right.
If that person was also going to target the school for violence and he's walking around in the vicinity of the school shooting into the air, you could classify that as a very high level of leakage. It's coming.
Mm-hmm.
So taking the response and having law enforcement contact them before any violence occurred at your school is all we're talking about. In that scenario, if we're using it, we're changing the circumstances to meet our discussion here. On the pathway to violence, that attack has already started. Operationally, that person is moving towards the target. In the strictest interpretation of the pathway to violence, there's nothing you can do. You just have to respond to it. But the fact of the matter is they stop somebody from dying as of the recording the date of this podcast, because the only one that was injured was the assailant.
Yep.
Right. So if we start moving into that sort of mindset, is I can stop it before it escalates to somebody else getting hurt, then we should do that. If we are looking at that from the context of a school, then there are things that are occurring today in every school that if we don't address, they're going to start escalating. And they might not materialize until years from now. But if we take those things now, or take those steps now, then we could ostensibly prevent them. But if we don't have all of the options, and all we're thinking about is lethal force, in many cases, there is a reason. Well, we've always had a baton, but those were our two uses of forces. We had a firearm and a baton, and then just sheer force of the officer, right? In the late 60s, early 70s, we started looking at other options. And it's because there were too many situations where law enforcement was put into that situation where here I have two options. I can either hit them with my stick or shoot them. And so people are starting to say, well, why don't you have other options? I don't know why I don't, but these are the options I have. And then it's evolved into many, many things. I got a call from a company the other day. They have something that's kind of similar to a taser, but different. It's a kind of a unique thing. It shoots out I think it's a Kevlar rope kind of thing. I think it's weighted on two ends and it wraps you up so you can't move.
That's like the old things they throw around your legs, and the balls would wrap around themselves and you'd fall over.
I haven't seen it work. She's supposed to send me some videos. I haven't seen it work, and I haven't had time to really do the research. But when you look at those kinds of options, there's nets that you can shoot out of essentially a cannon that go out and spread out and wrap somebody up. There's sticky foam that you can spray somebody down with the sticky foam, and it kind of locks them up. There's all kinds of options out there.
I got to see that one.
I'm not saying that we should or shouldn't do this, but you have to have those conversations, and you have to address that if you only have one option,
there's only so many things you can do.
You're going to end up using that option because it's the only option you have, and it's going to be something that you probably wish you'd had another option for. Fire hoses can be less lethal weapons. Fire extinguishers can be less lethal weapons. There's all kinds of things that can be used.
One of my last questions for you, Kelly, or the last question for you. We've been talking about less than lethal. Is this something you would ever consider if someone were to come into your school with a gun, like going down the hallway? Is that an option where, are we talking about less than lethal as an option for that scenario?
No.
I just want to make that clear.
The quick answer is no. We're not talking about meeting lethal force with less than lethal force, right? We're talking about meeting the force necessary to stop that from going. Now, there are less lethal options that might stop that. If you have a less lethal option and that's all you have, there's a lot of people who are talking about distraction devices, right? Mm-hmm. It's a less lethal if you have a very bright strobe light that disorients the shooter, then that's a less lethal option. At some point, you're going to have to get them to drop that weapon. The idea of less lethal is to get control over the subject so that they don't continue with whatever it is they're doing. The cons to less than lethal is that oftentimes you have to be very close to them. But there are things that are projectiles. They make paintball guns that shoot pepper balls.
They do.
Mm-hmm.
I had one pulled up actually. You want me to show it?
Oh, you can. I mean,
Hold on.
we're not advocating one thing over another, but there are ways to use less lethal from a distance. And so if you're not arming your...
This is what you're talking about.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
It looks like a paintball gun.
Looks like a paintball gun. Uh-huh.
But it shoots little pepper balls.
That's right. Mm-hmm.
Or nylon balls.
Or nylon balls. Uh-huh. That can increase the distance between you and whoever you're having. Oftentimes, there's the thought or the theory that, and I've seen it work, where if somebody breaks into your hold area where you're at, your lockdown area, they break into it, let's say, it's never happened, but if they do, and they are focused on harming somebody with a firearm, shooting, right? And you start throwing things at them, they're far less than lethal. That can distract them enough that you can control them and or escape, right? So that's why I like my hockey pucks. A few years back, as a little giveaway, I made some hockey pucks because I heard of a teacher, wasn't my idea, and I forget where the teacher was from, up north somewhere, because you'll understand why. As distraction devices, she taped a hockey puck to the underside of every child's desk. So if somebody came in, they would just grab this hockey puck and throw it at, if they were in lockdown, they would just grab the hockey puck. And if somebody came in, they would just throw at the hockey pucks. And if you've never held a hockey puck, it's a high density plastic, it's got a fair amount of weight. If you get hit by one of those, it doesn't matter if it's thrown by a third grader. It's going to distract you, right? Yeah. And if you now imagine that being thrown by a high schooler or a middle schooler who's got a pitching arm, right? Who knows how to throw.
And then times that by 30 or 40.
40, right? And then you have a plan to jump on or evacuate. That can be a huge benefit to you. That's all we're talking about. Think about these other options and how those work. And if you can throw something like a hockey puck, you can throw a hockey puck a pretty good distance. Even a young kid can throw a hockey puck 20, 30 feet, right? The length of a classroom. It's one of those things that maybe that's an option. I don't know. If you're talking about lethal options, morally speaking, you have to talk about, and in some cases, legally speaking, you have to talk about less than lethal options. There's plenty out there. Dogs, canines, patrol type dogs, these projectile wraps, the tasers, sound devices, lighting devices, mace, pepper spray, the pepper ball launchers, those types of things. Lots of options. But you have to talk about them, and you have to really be mindful and deliberate about what you're going to do. And like anything else in this world, you have to have policy. You have to have training. You have to look at those systems and make sure that they're working. You have to check on them all the time. And, we always talk about the 3 pillars, right? People, policies, and systems and processes.
If you enjoyed today's episode, please like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. And if you have any questions about what we discussed, leave a comment on our website at crisisgo.com. Thank you for joining us today, and we'll see you next time on Coffee with Kelly, a discussion on school safety.